we produced badger training guidelines as we did for the otter, and I shall come to the otter later, and we won't go over all of that. So the document was produced for people to read, which was fairly extensive, and then they came back to me as they'd finished, and then we went through a PowerPoint presentation. Having done that and it got everyone through that side of the course, we then attempted to get out on a field trip, which most people managed just as we were unlocked for a brief period of time. So that worked out quite well. Not quite so well for the otter side of things, and we've yet to complete the otter field trips to complete the course, but most people have got the benefit of everything that we did beforehand. So we had the contents for each course, going through the status, the physiology, ecology, paths, and all the signs that you would expect to find in the countryside, and particularly with mammals. You've got to read the signs. You don't generally just come across them. If you're lucky, you might just see an otter or some deer on the hill. But other than that, when you know what the signs are in the countryside, you can read a great deal more into your walk than otherwise would be the possibility there. So this is the members of the mustelid family, of which the badger is one. So we've got top left here, we've got the weasel, then polecat, then pine marten, otter in the centre, stoat bottom left, and then mink bottom right. And the mink is effectively the odd one out, although I sense he's going to be part of our fauna for many, many years to come. And of course, it's our reason, we were the reason for the problem of him being here in the first place, with fur farms being abandoned and the doors opened and allowed out. The consequences of that we've still yet to reap, I think. And from our point of view, to the north and west of us here on Skye, we've got water voles that are very much in the firing line. So here's the badger, and he's around up to a metre long, dependent on where he lives in the country and his diet. Quite low slung, very, very powerful front legs and indeed claws. A thick coat that he molts throughout the year, molts out from the head to the tail, and then reverse procedure with renewing the hair. And the grey effect is from the very long guard hairs that we see occasionally snagged on wire. So the main points really here are the breeding cycle and seasonal indicators. And the badger has delayed implantation. So in January, the females are pregnant but less active above ground, usually. But with climate change, we're seeing them at all times of day and night indeed, and particularly here in Highland. February, mating starts following the birth of cubs, and the males mark out their territory. This is February into March. Dung pits and latrines are marking out the territories and conveying a lot of information regarding the status of the badgers that are setting those off. And then we've got peak road kills, and we do collate the road kills, and you can see the seasonality of that. So in April, territorial marking starts to decline. May, June, the cubs come above ground, and we'll see that a little later with a video, and they'll start to learn to forage. September, the second main mating, September and October. October, dung pits and latrines appear, but less than spring. And then December, the fertilized egg, having formed a blastocyst, becomes implanted into the uterus, and a conventional pregnancy starts around the shortest day, 20th, 21st of December. And that happens irrespective of when the cubs are born. So habitats and sets. So here you can see at the top here, we've got conifers, broadleaves and pasture. And this is effectively almost ideal habitat from a badger point of view. You've got a sloping bank down to a burn at the bottom. You've got a graded bank where they can dig their sets, because they generally live underground, although we have evidence that they stay above ground at times in really warm weather. And then we have the pasture for foraging, because they're well, we'll come on to the diet shortly. So these are some of the habitats that we find our badgers in. So from that idyllic area just to the west of Inverness in Highland, we have this much closer to home in Lochalsh, and we have active badger sets in that glen, which are over 500, well, around close to 600 metres up in the glen there, and they survive and thrive indeed. And indeed, if you're walking out in Lochalsh, quite often you might expect to come across a badger, and there was a whole series of images that we got with him coming across the moorland, across to the path that we were walking up here, and across and on. He took no notice. So here we are in the bottom of the glen now, and you can see a big excavation. This is very wet ground beyond where you can see the excavation, but the ground surrounding that is like a small moraine, and it's a deposit of glacial sand, and the badgers like well-drained substrate, and they dig very happily into that. As we've seen, they have the tools to do that. And we find them even right down at sea level in marram grass, where the marram has consolidated the dunes. It's sufficient to hold the tunnels together and provide them with a set underground. So set, S-E-T-T, is their place of resting. Here we are in forestry, and you can see the massive amount of excavation here, and going on and way down beyond. This is a colossal set, and when it comes to harvesting, it can create all sorts of massive problems because badgers do have legislation on their side when it comes to harvesting. So we have to go through a whole host of procedures. We have them in towns and cities, and whilst this is actually Edinburgh, the same is now starting to apply to Inverness. So you can see an aerial view of the city, and you may just see 2 red dots, and these are badger main sets just in the areas left by the development. And as I say, we are literally seeing all that occurring now in Inverness. But fortunately, we were able to get in well before the development took place. We identified all of the pathways, where the sets were, and they were accommodated. And better than in Edinburgh, we were able to put tunnels under the roads to allow them to link up all their territories. So it's a pretty safe area for badgers generally in Inverness, which is really good conservation. So as we see here, we've got an opportunistic omnivore, foraging behaviour and food, a really true omnivore. And here we are on the shore, just round the corner from Melanie, who is just out here. There's Skye on the opposite side, and you can see some foraging in the foreground here, where the turf has been turned over into the sand. And this is what they were looking for. There's chafer larvae and earthworms, and the invertebrates form the majority of their dietary requirements. But it is a very wide requirement, and they have to forage pretty extensively over some really hard winters. Here we've got a badger that's actually in foraging mode. To the right, bottom right here, you can see what we call a snuffle hole, and here's a badger having detected some invertebrate, diving the nose and teeth in there to extract it, and the claw has just pulled back the vegetation to do that. And here we are where they go around on the hillside, finding dung patches, and they usually turn those over, and they're usually dung beetles or beetles of some sort for them to crunch on. Elder is also, when it's available to them, taken in the autumn. And then in the hard winters, a deer carcass attracts badgers from considerable distance. They're able to do that because the sense of smell is very acute, and the slightest whiff on the breeze will take them in to be able to forage. And here we see 4 badgers surrounding a carcass. And then a fox comes in, but the fox is incredibly wary. He really wouldn't tackle a badger, I think he understands how powerful the teeth are, and indeed the front claws. So he had to wait for the badger to finish his fill before he came in. So as we're walking around, we always look at barbed wire fencing just in case there are hairs snagged on, looking for the signs. And these are some of those guard hairs, maybe 10 centimetres long, thereabouts, or 4 inches if we go back to the old money. White tip, black band, and then a straw colour as it comes to join the skin. That's a fairly typical colour, but we do get variations on that. Typical tracks, walking gait here with double registers in normal walking gait almost. And you see on the right here, an actual double register. You see the massive claw marks in the front paws, followed on by a large heel and pad shape where the hind foot with much shorter claws superimposes over the front paw. That's a fairly typical normal walking gait. Dung pit's pretty important for badgers, and because of the sense of smell, they have scent glands at the anal gland, and they deposit the scent through the feces, and that gives other badgers great clues as to the status of the badger that's deposited that, and indeed whether they're welcome in that territory or not. Pathways are also quite important. You can just see this one coming down the bank here. And here we have some our latest current survey, and Esme here is pointing out the path that she's just found. You can just see it snaking through the vegetation, coming to the oak and back towards the fence line. So all of that is recorded. Now, as we went, as the members went through the course, we said that as we got to the end, that it would be quite a good ploy, perhaps to employ trail cameras. And Lindsay, who's absolutely up for everything and anything, she stays in Lochalsh, which is really good. And this is on the lower slopes of Ben Concra. And so she deployed a SLEF trail camera and some of her own as well. And here's part of the results of that. Now, this is April, and we became aware that there were cubs underground, and we'll see why shortly. So this is the female leaving the set, as you can see, in full daylight, and she's collecting bedding. And here she comes with a great big bundle of potentially Molinia or all sorts of dry grasses, and that would then go underground. So they have loads of chambers underground, and sometimes they will store bedding like that. And as the cubs grow and soil the vegetation, they will swap over the bedding areas and clean out the old soiled bedding. So here we now have the female still now in April, once again, really in full light, and the confines of the set mean that you need to do a great deal of grooming.
This is brilliant.
So as you see her continuing to groom like this, and this is very typical of badgers from the New Forest right the way up through to North Highland. And as you see her roll back and continue with the grooming, you'll be aware of 6 distended teats just as she comes to finish. And that was where we were convinced that she'd definitely got cut. There you can see under her chin there, there are 6 distended teats there. So we knew she'd been feeding youngsters, but obviously we didn't quite know how many. So this was April, and this was cold. We had -8s in last April, if anyone remembers, February, March, and early April. So now this one, unfortunately, we had a slight hiccup with the camera, but nevertheless, this from our point of view is a record shot, which proves that we had 3 cubs from that female. And you can see they're quite young. So this is May, just into May now, and this is their first exploratory trip, or one of the first exploratory trips above ground. Okay, so now when the cubs have grown, you get into some really serious play. Now this is at another set, but it's indicative of how boisterous they can get. You see the one in the foreground almost unconcernedly just grooming his front left leg, whilst the other one is being attacked on the ruff, or on the scruff rather. And then this one's showing bedding collection and also grooming. So you need to focus your left eye on the grooming and the right eye on the bedding collection. You can see the subcaudal gland there just below the tail, and they deposit all sorts of different scents. And this one that's just returned above ground is musking the other one. They have what we call a clan scent. Each badger musks on its partners multiple times during the day, and indeed as they progress around their territories, they deposit scent almost every few 5 meters or so. And so even at the worst possible conditions, they can actually go around almost blind and know exactly where they are. So good is their sense of smell. So if we've got any questions for that, I'd be very happy to answer those. Otherwise, we can go straight on to the otter and do the same again. If there's anything you think about as we come to the end, then we can do it then. So we got otters all at sea and elsewhere, and this was for the SLEF. So the same collage again. The otter disappeared from the middle, and here we see the badger. So we've already described the mustelid family that badger and otter belong to. So here we see an otter in fairly typical pose in the water, being very low in the water, nose, eyes and ears all in one line, and this enables him to move around his territory unseen, if you like, because they've been heavily persecuted in the past, and as a consequence they tend to stay out of sight as best they can. Much more relaxed here on the west coast in general though. And here we can see that nose, eyes, ears all in one line, so they can come to the surface very slowly. But most importantly here for the otter are these vibrissae, these stiff whiskers here. They also have those on their front inner wrist areas, and they're very, very sensitive indeed. And these are used for detecting prey, say under seaweed, particularly for our coastal otters. They would detect the slightest movement, say from an eel, and they would go in. And the eel is probably the most favoured prey. And here we are in walking gait. This is a male otter. We tend not to use the hunting terms of dog and bitch now, so we tend to go male and female and cub. But he's actually got quite a large crab here, which he's brought on shore to consume. And here we see the front pads, or the front pad here, which shows just partial webbing. People used to think that they had a full web, rather like a beaver, but they don't in fact, but it's still a pretty effective paddle. And then the hind foot, very similar again. So here we got the mustelids from a point of view of the pad marks, pine marten top left, stoat in the centre and the weasel, all relative size, and mink here, very often splayed like that in soft substrata. Here's the otter, as we've just seen, and then the badger with his claws. That's the hind foot, and much longer for the front claws. And here we are crossing a road, unfortunately, in the snow. And then this was 1995 when we had a big dump of snow. We had about 8 inches, and the left-hand image shows the track coming in from the left, and you just see a raised bit of substrate here. That's a grass tump, but that's a spraint site. In other words, otters are marking their territory out, and he knew exactly where it was from his scent, and he deposited some scent on that and then tracked off down the bank. On the right here, as he approached the bottom of the bank, in other words, he tobogganed to the bottom, and as he got to the flat at the right on the bottom of the bank there, he had to do his lolloping along in through the snowdrifts, and you can just detect the tail, the tapering tail cutting into the snowdrift here. And when otters run, their tail rotates. So that's one of the strikes for the otter's tail as he turns through the deep snow. So once again, it's signs that are vital for us, and this is marvelous. We could almost anywhere you go on the west coast here, you're going to find signs of otters. And if we look on the left here, it's enriched grass here. Another one there, another one here, and another one in the foreground as well here. So this is heavily marked out. Sea is behind us here, and we're going inland into a burn. And this is heavily marked out, in effect, to tell other otters, this is my territory, and you can forget the feeding because I've got it all under control. So this is one local to us here at Isle Hornsey, and you can see this highly raised section, and that's what the otters have built up, potentially over hundreds of years. A spraint being deposited and tiny fragments built up, and insects come along and die, and the vegetation grows round it. It gets grazed by various animals, usually sheep, and it forms these columns. So if you find one like that, you'll know you've got a really historical otter territory. Pathways again, in the foreground, spraint site. And here we go to freshwater pools. Now, freshwater pools in the west coast are very, very important, because if we had no fresh water for the otters, like pools for them to bathe in, we would have no otters. Their coats would clog up with salt crystals, and effectively they would die very quickly. So they take a lot of pleasure, if you like, and a lot of time in grooming, as we've seen in the badgers, and we'll see with the otters just a little later. The enrichment of the grass here from spraint, and there's a spraint just in the foreground here. And here's another spraint site with lots of crab remains. I won't ask James to identify that one, but in this one in the corner here, you can see the puncture marks from the canine teeth. And a small flatfish here could be plaice or flounder or dab, I suspect, but I'm no fish biologist, I'm afraid. But what I do know is that the otters absolutely love them and bring them on shore. Anything large, any large fish needs to be brought to shore. The smaller fish are able to be consumed in the sea. They can just hold them in their front paws. So the diet is very varied, and whilst it's mostly fish based, occasionally they do take birds, and this is a black guillemot, and you can see the foot has now been severely attacked and part of the breast eaten. So it would be taken from underneath and dragged onto shore. We've actually seen, and I have got images, but we're not showing tonight, them kill a cormorant, which took about 15 minutes, and an unbelievable battle. But here's one that you can look out for whilst you're walking along the shores, is look out for hoodies. You see 3 here, and if you see them concentrating like that and following along the shoreline, it may well be that they're following an otter. In other words, they're trying to scare him off food that he might have brought to shore to consume, and that very often happens, and quite often the otter will give up unless he's very hungry. So here we are around 1,800 feet in the Cooling Hills. We have a wee lochen, and at about this time of the year, March, quite an important sight from another element of the otter's diet, and that's frogs. And indeed, we've this week we've had 4 deposits of frog spawn in our pool, and so this is what the otters are targeting. And although I can't prove it, but I'm pretty sure on our burn here at Hornsey, the spraint sites become active at about this time, and I sense that the otters can detect scent of frogs and frog spawn in the water coming down from where we know they deposit thousands and thousands of eggs. So I think that they then follow the burn up, and they're able to find exhausted frogs which they consume, but the next generation is safe in the water. And here's a consumed frog in the edge of the pool there. So a very good meal. As we see how important the fresh water is to otters, and you can see this one was lapping before the shutter of the camera unfortunately disturbed him. We do try not to disturb if possible. So we have a little sequence of videos here. This is very brief on swimming, just showing you how they propel through the water. And as they approach shore, you won't quite see it here, they tend to dive, so you don't quite see where they actually come ashore. So coastal territory size is 4 to 5 kilometers, and that's for a breeding female. The male, quite often in the West here, one male may have 2 females that he breeds with, and he moves between territories and can move considerable distances. But a female will usually be within 4 or 5 kilometers of a coastline. Contrast that with inland waterways, where a mature female would have 15 to 20 kilometers and males 30 to 45 kilometers. Now, when you think about it, the food resource from a river or a burn like that is considerably less than we would have here on the coastal strip. Our otters are pretty spoiled from a point of view of the amount of feed that they have available. But small salmonids, trout, eels would get up here, and there would be obviously frogs, but that's about it. Whereas our otters here on the coast have all of the marine species to look at and go at. So we've got a little bit of grooming, and we've got a few of these for us to have a look at. And this particular otter, it groomed for over an hour, and this is a small section of it. With an oyster catcher for accompaniment. It shows rather nicely the four limbs there, and you'll see that it tensions the tail to get a good purchase on the whatever it is that's irritating him in his guard hairs there. Lots of nibbling going on and cleaning and getting down to the underfur. Underfur is almost waterproof, but not quite. So this is why they need to groom pretty consistently, and hence the reason why fresh water is so important. She's got a rather scarred chin. I suspect that's from some rather large crabs she may well have taken in the past. So we also have albinos inhabiting our coast. This is in Loch Horn from a few years ago, courtesy of Jane Bowman, which shows the whole sequence very nicely indeed. Now onto the rest sites, and this one is a particularly important one, and otters have considerably more legislation attached to them than badgers do, because they're highly vulnerable to disturbance. And this is an inland lochen, and in the bank of there is a single hole that's just been cleaned out. You can just see it there, and this is actually a natal site. Otters tend to move away quite often from the shore to produce their cubs, and then they're brought back to the main holts on the coastline once the otter cubs have grown to a certain stage. So these are highly vulnerable sites, and one, if you come across with the forestry, which you see this in, precludes forestry from working around it up to 200 meters. This is the water supply for Isle, and in the side of the loch here we have a peat overhang which has an otter hold in it, and this is one that we're watching quite carefully, because if they decided to put a larger dam to get more water supply for us, then we would need to have serious talks about them potentially flooding an otter hold. And we get this right across the moorland. We see these peat hags that the otters will move into, and they're highly susceptible to muir burn, and we have had a number of holts burnt out. But this is fairly conventional for an otter holt in West Coast, and particularly here on Skye. An enormous lump of rock has come out of the cliff and created all sorts of cavities underneath. And if you can just detect the enrichment by what we would call a fish-based nitrogenous fertilizer deposited on a regular basis, creating that greening effect for the grass, there's an indication that they're otters using underneath. Now occasionally, and the same, almost exactly the same applies to for badgers, is that they make what we call day nests, and this, as you can see, is in some wind-thrown conifers, and they just use those generally mid-territory if they're away from the coast, and they want to just settle down for a while, they'll just curl up in that underneath the fallen trunk, and they're able to rest quite quietly, because generally people don't get into and underneath most of the windthrow that we have. But it's an important thing to know that you need to do a peripheral survey of an area like that to see if there are otters going into before it gets cleared, if it needs to be. At the other extreme, and this is just south of Fort William, an old Bedford van, which was an ideal site for an otter holt. And quite interestingly, up and down the coast there, down towards the Corran Ferry, there were very few opportunities for holt sites, and this one was extensively used in the back, and they were sprinting in the old driver's seat as a mark out. But we do have lots of otters killed on that section, because most of the holt sites are the other side of the road, and we're trying to discuss with them about putting a tunnel underneath, but that's not easy with a strapped for cash council. So just to point out that the activity in the next video requires a license from Nature Scott. In other words, we can't just go around plonking cameras around otter holts. But this is quite a unique little bit of footage showing an otter collecting green bedding. And we're not quite sure why. Badgers will take in green bedding, and whether it's used as an insecticide or not, I'm not sure, with bracken and so on, but it would certainly generate heat underground, so that there could be mutual benefits both ways there. So you can see there's a spraint site underneath the chin there, but here's the bedding collection now. So we've got another little bit of writhing female on the same site that we mentioned before, but she'd moved out into the open this time.